Which one?
4 o'clock now in Lima. We're very glad to be here the way we can. I'm Carolina Araujo. I am the chair of this session and the female voice of the day. And I'm here to present 4 great speakers. And we have a change in the program, the same people, but we are doing a change for Roberto Granieri is speaking to us from Italy, and it's very late at night there. So Roberto is speaking first, and then we're following the order. As I was told, we have each speaker has 40 minutes for the talk and the question and answers. I will notify you when you have 30 minutes and you decide if you want to finish with your 10 last minutes or if you want to stop and listen to the questions. And I will interrupt you at 40 minutes. And I begin by introducing Roberto Granieri. I had my notes here, but everything disappeared. Okay. Roberto Granieri is at the University of Leuven, and he has been working on Plato, paper coming out on the Philebus, and another one on the Sophist. And today he's gonna talk to us about Koinonia ousias, or why for Plato to be is not to be something. Roberto, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for putting this program together and for accepting my proposal. So I just put in the chat a handout, but I'm also going to share my screen so that everybody can follow my paper as I read it. So without further ado, I suppose you can now see my screen. Is that correct? Can anybody confirm that?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Okay, thank you. Okay, so, and I mean, if somebody comes later, I'll ask either the chair or somebody else to repost the handout in the chat, because I think if somebody comes later, can't see the previous attachments. Okay, so there is an entrenched scholarly consensus regarding Plato's conception of being. It is aptly summarized by the famous slogan introduced by Owen, that for Plato to be is to be something. This slogan is commonly explained by saying that for Plato to be is always to exemplify or instantiate a determinate property and not just to exist. Thus, when Plato says, for example, that motion is, he doesn't mean that motion just exists, but that motion is as moving, or is itself, or is in motion. This account is not unique to, though probably more widespread among scholars working in Owen's footsteps, or to analytically trained historians more generally. In fact, already Etienne Gilson had contended that, I quote, to the question, in what sense can it be said that a Platonic idea is, there is but one answer. It is, in the sense that it's wholly and exclusively that which it is. The Platonic notion of being is not only entirely foreign to existence, but inconsistent with it. The consensus, end quote. The consensus is therefore orthogonal to the notorious analytic continental divide, and defenses of it have come from many quarters. Here, I propose to challenge this consensus by considering some passages of the Sophists which show, I believe, that when being is metaphysically analyzed by Plato in terms of participation in or combination with the kind or form of being, it does not mean to be something or to be itself or to be variously characterized or similia, but to exist. The passage at Sophist 250a11b11 is the main focus of my analysis, to be scrutinized in sections 1 and 2 of my paper. In the former, section 1, I contend that it disproves the orthodoxy, whereas in the latter, section 2, I argue that it broaches a conception of being according to which something is, due to its combination which or participation in, the two phrases are interchangeable, the kind or form of being, i.e. one of the megistegene. My case is strengthened as I show in the same section as I show in the same section, by the examination of other passages, which I argue deploy an explanatory pattern analogous to 250a11b11, which is, I'm going to read it later. It's text 1 on your handout. I finally leave for section 3 a reply to an objection based on a different, and I believe incorrect, understanding of the notion of the kind being, as well as a brief comparison with Aristotle's conception of being. So now going to section 1 of my paper. We begin with a modicum of context. The sophist's avowed purpose to provide an account of what a sophist is soon turns out to involve a range of insidious problems, giving the dialogue a Chinese box structure. There emerges that defining the sophist requires the preliminary disarming of the paradox of falsehood, which in turn demands a prior assessment of Parmenides' ban of not being. And since not being is proved untreatable, as unthinkable and inexpressible, the Eleatic stranger proposes to confront Parmenides by first focusing on being. There begins an inquiry into what being is, governed by a typical definitional question reminiscent of those habitually raised in Plato's earlier dialogues, but also partly unprecedented, in that for the first time the definiendum is not a being, but being itself, to on or to einai. The investigation starts off by sifting through the views of other thinkers who made pronouncements about being, the dualists, the monists, and the two opposing parties of the notorious gigantomachy. All succumb to the Eleatic stranger's critical scrutiny. A last attempt to provide an account of being is then made by the Eleatic stranger himself through the so-called children's prayer. Being and all, I quote, are such things are both immovable and movable. Theaetetus deludes himself that with this logos a satisfactory result has been achieved, but the Eleatic stranger immediately disenchants him by raising a further aporia. He contends that the logos of the children's prayer is open to the same objection addressed earlier to the dualists. Just as being could not be the hot and the cold, so too it cannot be motion and rest. This argument can be summarized as follows, and you have on your handout, it's at page 3 of your handout, the same schema I have on my paper. Motion and rest are most contrary to each other, and yet both are and to be is said in the same way, homoios, of both and each, amphotera audaca ekateron, of them. 3, for both and each of them to be does not mean either to be in motion or to be at rest. Instead, motion and rest are due to their combination with being, which is the third thing along motion and rest, and encompassing them. 5, being is not motion and rest together, but something other than these. 6, by its own nature, being is neither in motion nor at rest. And finally, 7, being falls outside both motion and rest, meaning that it does not instantiate either motion or rest, i.e., it neither moves nor rests. Now, the literature abounds with examinations of this argument, but the debate has largely been dominated by the problem that since 7 seems false, due to the exhaustiveness of the pair motion-rest, and is explicitly regarded as impossible by Theaetetus, there must be some surreptitious misstep in the argument. Thus, scholars have variously suggested that statements of identity and predication get here confused, or that the adverbial phrase by its own nature is misunderstood, or yet that placing being outside motion or rest is erroneous. And the problem is genuine, and the debate not idle. But it has eclipsed, I believe, a key point of our passage, namely its explicit rejection of analysis of to be as to be something. Look again at statements 2 and 3. In the former, the Eleatic stranger submits that einai is said in the same way, homoios, of motion, rest, and of both motion and rest together. That is, when we say motion is, rest is, and motion and rest are, being holds in the same way, respectively, of motion, rest, and both motion and rest together, and therefore the verb einai is predicated in the same sense of them all. What is this sense? Statement 3 immediately clears the field of a possible wrong, if now widespread, answer. It is, for both and each of motion and rest, neither to be in motion nor to be at rest. Plato's reiterated emphasis on the pair amphoterakai kateron invites us to break down this statement by reformulating it in a slightly different but perfectly equivalent phraseology. 3a. For motion, to be is neither to be in motion nor to be at rest. For rest, to be is neither to be at rest nor to be in motion. And for both motion and rest, to be is neither to be in motion nor to be at rest. Why does Plato think so? It doesn't tell, but the following seems a safe guess. Suppose to be meant to be in motion. Then, since to be in motion expresses the nature of motion, and since to be is ex hypothesis set in the same way of both an itch of motion and rest, then it would follow that to move would express the nature of rest too, i.e. that rest is, just like motion, by its own nature in motion. And this seems impossible because motion and rest are contraries. An analogous case could obviously be made if to be were taken to mean to be at rest. Thus, for both an itch of motion and rest, to be is neither to be in motion nor to be at rest. Now, if the consensus view were true, namely to be is to be something, then taking motion as a specimen, one would have to analyze motion is are motion moves, or motion has the nature of what moves, or motion is in motion. And this is in fact exactly what some commentators say. For example, Paul Seligman, following explicitly Owen and Frege, writes that when Plato, I quote, says motion is or motion and rest are, he doesn't use the verb to be in our existential sense. Motion is as moving and only as moving. It is a what, a nature, end quote. Contra, statement 3a establishes precisely that this is not the case. For motion, we are told, to be is not to be in motion, just like it's not to be at rest. And the same, of course, holds for rest and any other comparable subject. Hence, these lines, I submit, explicitly controvert the consensus view. But if for motion to be is not to move or to have the nature of what moves, then what is it for it to be? Now look back at statement 4 now. It posits that motion and rest are because of their combination with being, prostentes ousias Koinōnia, which is a third thing along motion and rest, triton ti para tauta, and encompassing them, pedikomenon. The intentionally underdeterminate phrase third thing, triton ti, obviously prefigures the claim, explicitly made just a few pages later, and again in the rest of the dialogue, of course, that being is an independent kind, genos, or form, eigos. Hence, we have here a causal analysis of what it is for something to be. X is due to its combination with or participation in the kind or form of being, i.e. one of the megistogen. And this is a key move and calls for attention. Plato is here implementing at once two familiar and closely interconnected explanatory strategies. The first is that of accounting for something's possession of a given attribute or property by appealing to its combination with, or again, participation in, a form or kind which is that property by its own nature and whose name names that property. Thus, just as, say, the beauty of a plurality of particulars was explained in Phaedo, Appius Major, and Symposium through their participation in the form of beauty, so too here the being of motion and rest is explained through their participation in the kind or form of being. Yet, it should also be noted that although the previous cross-examination of rival views on being arguably paved the way for the isolation of a kind being, at this point of the dialogue we have not yet heard anything about an independent kind being. It is only with the assessment of the children's prayer that such a kind is expressly introduced as an entity in its own right. We can then see the second strategy implemented by Plato in this passage, which is that of a typical one over many argument. The Eleatic stranger postulates the existence of a form of being as the adequate metaphysical principle grounding the possession by a plurality of objects other than that form and partaking in that form of the property that form's name names, i.e. being. The interconnection of the two explanatory strategies should now be clear. In the very moment in which the Eleatic stranger accounts for the being of motion and rest by appealing to their combination with the kind being, he is also singling out that very kind as the appropriate metaphysical principle grounding the property of being possessed by both motion and rest. Two further points on this. First, both strategies are silently based on the additional, and admittedly unargued, two-pronged premise that the property being is a natural one and is predicated univocally. For on the one hand, Plato simply assumes that the verb einai refers to a joint carving property and is not merely a common name such as barbarian to which no form corresponds, as the statesman famously argues. Being, instead, is a real property which ought to be metaphysically explained by evoking the relevant form, i.e. the form of being, of course. On the other hand, the homoios at 250a11 shows that Plato takes the verb einai to be predicated in one sense only, and was to be expected, since the property it denotes is obtained through participation in a single form. Second, the consideration of these two strategies also enables us to eschew interpretations of Plato's notion of being in the sophist in terms of self-identity, i.e. interpretations analyzing motion is as motion is identical to itself. Leuven famously championed this view. Such exegesis, however, sits uneasily with Plato's argument for the non-identity of the kind identity and the kind being. The property of being the same as itself is due to sharing in the former, the kind identity, and not in the latter, the kind being. In modern terms, the truth makers of F is and F is identical to itself are two distinct states of affairs, i.e. two distinct participatory relations, the former in the kind being, the latter in the kind identity. The property obtained by combination with the kind being is just that of being simpliciter, and not of being the same as itself. So the interim conclusion is therefore that, contrary to the current orthodoxy, to be is not, for the Plato of the sophist, to be something or to be variously characterized or to be identical to itself. It is instead a distinctive property obtained through participation in or combination with a distinctive kind, i.e. the kind being. I see no impediment to the identification of this property of being with existence. And the Eleatic stranger repeated emphasis on the kind being's all-pervasiveness, which suggests that the property of being cannot fail to obtain, at least of real unities which are not a matter of mental fabrication, corroborates this view. Now, some might think our passage is an isolated case, and she would be wrong. For the foregoing analysis of our text 1 is corroborated by several other passages of the dialogue which deployed the same explanatory pattern. Here are 4 such passages. At 254 D10, and I think this is text 2, text 2 on your handout at the end of page 3, motion and rest are said to be because the kind being blends make ton with them. Now, the adjective make ton from the verb megnumi is used in the dialogue, especially in the form submignumi, interchangeably with other verbs or locutions, indicating participation such as metekein, metalambanein, koinonein, epikoinonein, or ekein koinonias. Thus, motion and rest enjoy the property of being in virtue of their sharing in the kind being, which causes their possession of that property. At 256a1, the Eleatic stranger, and this is text 3 on your handout, avers that motion is, because, I quote, because of its sharing in being, end quote. The locution dia plus accusative is among Plato's standard formulae to express his notion of causality. The genitive to ontos picks up the kind being, namely one of the 5 greatest kinds singled out in the previous pages of the dialogue. Again, motion, here taken as a specimen of any participant in the kind being, possesses the property in virtue of its sharing in the kind being, which is therefore the cause of it enjoying the property. The claim is reiterated at 256 D9, which is still text 3 on your handout, in a slightly different phraseology. The Eleatic stranger has just pointed out that motion shares in the kind difference in relation to being. By foreshadowing the forthcoming semantic analysis of negation as expressing difference and not only contrariety, he infers that motion, I quote, really is a not being, end quote. On top of this, the Eleatic stranger adds that despite its being a not being, motion is a being, because it partakes in being, to ontos meteke. And finally, text 4 in your handout, at 259a67, the same point already generalized at 256 e34 is cashed out in relation to the kind difference. I quote, difference with its sharing what is because of that sharing. So the explanatory pattern found in the critical assessment of the account of being of the children's prayer is therefore not an isolated case. In the Sophist, Plato consistently appeals to participation in the kind being to account for something's possession of the property of being. So I'm moving now to the third and final section of my paper. One might object to my reading by advocating the perhaps intuitive view that the Platonic kind being is not a metaphysical causal principle responsible for the property of being, but a genus of all genera. This construal, which can arguably trace back to Aristotle's metaphysics, particular group beta, and has been supported by several modern interpreters, locates the kind being atop of a universal Porphyrian tree. Such an overarching kind would then branch out into all the various species and subspecies of reality. The kind being is thus regarded as something like a summum genus of whatness, a most general kind essence, which we encounter when we get to the summit of a hierarchical classificatory account of kinds based on the extensional criterion of the generality of their intelligible content. So as we work upwards from the lowest species by asking what it is at each step, the kind being will be the point of arrival of our ascent. And this seems to chime with the slogan, to be is to be something. Why? For if the kind being is a most generic genus of whatness, it seems one can safely draw the implication that by partaking in being, something obtains its own determinate nature. However, there is a major reason to resist this construal. Specifically, there is a major impediment for interpreting the relation between the kind being and its participants in terms of the genus-species relation. This relation, at least as Aristotle describes it in the Organon and is conceived of by modern champions of the reading I'm assessing, is never symmetrical. A genus is predicated of the species falling under it, but a species is never predicated in turn of its genus. Consider, by contrast, the relationship between being and difference. Each is predicated of the other, for being partakes in, but is also partaken in by difference. Their relation is therefore symmetrical. Hence, they do not share to each other, they do not stand to each other as genera stand to their species, in the Aristotelian sense of this. The same case could be made about being and identity, which are both all-pervasive, and therefore partake in each other. Thus, the objection contending that the kind being is not a metaphysical causal principle responsible for the property its name names, i.e. the property of being, but a genus of all genera, is uncompelling. I've argued that in the Sophists, Plato is committed to a participatory conception of being, such that something is due to its participation in the kind being. Now, to fully appreciate the distinctive significance of this position, a comparison with Aristotle may prove instructive. In a forthcoming magisterial paper on Aristotle and the many senses of being, Stephen Mann argues, persuasively I believe, that according to Aristotle, the correct method to make existential sentences involving one place being, for example, F is, amenable to causal analysis is to rewrite them by, first, turning them into sentences involving two-place being, and second, moving the subject term F to predicate position, and third, introducing a subject, primarily the per se subject of F, of which the new predicate holds. So we have from F is F. Thus, to explain the fact that F exists, we need not look for a cause that supplies existence to F, but for something that supplies F-ness to some subject S, primarily, again, the per se subject of F. So the cause of being, aition to einai, of F, is, for Aristotle, the ousia of F, the essence of F. Thus, the second meaning of ousia listed at Metaphysics Delta 8 is, quote, that which, being present in such things as are not predicated of a subject, is the cause of being, aition to einai, as the soul is of the being of animals. Now, the example of the soul makes it clear that Aristotle is thinking of the formal cause as something's internal cause of being. In the Sophist, I submit, precisely the alternative view is maintained. As I've been arguing throughout this paper, Plato avers that to explain the fact that F is, i.e. exists, we need to look for a cause that supplies being to F. So the cause of the being of F is not the ousia of F, as Aristotle would have it, but a metaphysical principle which, by its own nature, provides being to all the objects bearing the appropriate participatory relation with it. This cause is the kind being. Such a hiatus between Plato's and Aristotle's conceptions of being is worth noting because precisely those interpreters who have maintained that for Plato to be is always to be something have also submitted pari passu that this is common ground between Plato and Aristotle. So, for example, Owen, exactly when he introduced his influential slogan "to be something," added, "If it's true that for Plato to be is always to be something, then I quote." Plato's analysis becomes the direct parent of Aristotle's, end quote. The foregoing remarks enable us, I hope, to resist both the slogan and the juxtaposition with Aristotle. The consensus view on Plato's conception of being lacks, therefore, the cogency claimed for it. I've argued, in the limited time at my disposal, that a proper metaphysical analysis of Plato's conception of a kind being, as it is systematized in the Sophist, enables us to question the core of this entrenched orthodoxy. I have defended the view that when being is metaphysically analyzed by Plato in terms of participation in the kind being, X is because it partakes in the kind being, as is so often the case in the Sophists, to be does not stand for to be something or to be itself or to be variously characterized or similar, but should be understood in terms of existence. And while I think the consensus view is open to further objection and does not easily account, for example, for the ontological status of the Timaeus receptacle or the Republic's idea of the good, notice that I'm not committed to the view that for Plato to be is never to be something. For it might perhaps be reasonably argued, for instance, that the Owenian slogan, especially as interpreted by Leslie Brown, helps making good sense of other texts of the Platonic corpus, such as the fiendish side lover's argument in Republic 5. But there, as in most other dialogues, Plato does not isolate a kind being as he does in the Sophists. Instead, in the Republic as elsewhere, being, to on ousia, refers to the intelligible domain in general, typically contrasted by Plato within constant flux and variety of perceptible things, collectively oft-termed becoming, genesis. And this makes all the difference. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Roberto. We are open for questions. I think you can raise your hand or use the chat. Pauline, please go ahead.
All right. So thank you very much, Roberto, for your paper. I have two questions for you. My first question has to do with your what you say at some point, but being is predicated univocally, and you base it on the homoios. And I was wondering what you think about it, because the homoios as such, if I'm correct, that's the first time it happens. But if we look at the text that comes before, so I think that's most like the homoios that we get on that line is perhaps the hossa that we get at the end of the Gigantomachia passage at 249 D3. And yes, so I was wondering about how the way to understand the homoios here, because I mean, yeah, where does it come from then, if not from this conclusion of the Gigantomachia? And if it does come from the conclusion of the Gigantomachia, then the hossa has a kind of quantitative aspect as well. So that was my first question. My second question, so I was wondering what you make of a certain passage. So again, the last argument before the Gigantomachia, before the conclusion of the Gigantomachia passage, and I'm looking, for instance, at the line at, I think it must be 249 B12 C2, depending on which line you're following. So it's it's in the latter argument before the conclusion. So the one that you can think that starts with symbane and so on. And then at some point, we have this like, katauta, kai usautos, kai perito auto, kai soi corista seos, genesais potean. Okay. And I find this passage very striking, especially in regard to your claim, because one way to read that line, for instance, is to say that, without stasis, what is always the same in the same way and about the says will not come to be at all. And the line doesn't say wouldn't come to be at rest or anything like this. It seems to be a claim about simply about the being of what is always the same and so on. And I find it striking because it's not being, but is in that line. I mean, it doesn't say that it's without being or without a form of being, saying, alone, as you said, this wouldn't come to be. It says that it would be so, but in relation to stasis and not to being. So I was wondering how you understand that passage. Thanks.
Okay, so regarding the first question, the ousia. So if I'm correct, you're speaking about the three, the 249 D3 of the new OCT. I mean that's a notoriously complicated passage to translate, and there are different ways, different stances on especially. I mean, there are people who think that here the stranger thinks that the conclusion is that being is as many things as are both immovable and movable, or both things that are immovable and movable. So it's a summative claim. But I'm not entirely sure I got the point about its relation to homoios, because even if one takes the let me label it extensional reading, right? It might still be the case that both things that are immovable, namely, say, forms, and things that are in motion, namely, sensibles, are by their participation in being. And it's in the same way that they are because both tietetas, say, and the form of motion are due to their combination with the kind being. So perhaps I misunderstood the first point, or there was something else I'm missing.
No, I mean, the point is that depending on what, where you understand the, what you think, where you think the homoios come from, then I think it might still means, so it could mean slightly different things. So for instance, if you take it much more extensionally, then you could say something like, well, it just, by homoios here, it's just meant that none of them, neither rest nor change has more, is more being than the other, or is less being than the other. But that doesn't mean that what it is for something to be in each case is the same. It may be a matter more of importance than, for instance, if you contrast it with some views like that of the forms of the friends of the forms, which would perhaps have preferred something like, okay, what is it, or rest is primarily, and change is in a kind of secondary way. It's more a matter of putting them on the same level, and then less about what is meant behind this. So that was the thought behind.
Yeah. Just I mean, now I'm trying to understand this point a bit better. But I mean, if you look at 250, 11, 258, 11, 12, I mean, what it says exactly is not that motion and rest are in the same way, but that being holds in the same way of both and each of motion and rest. So the point is about being, it's not about motion and rest. And that's why I think it's worth emphasizing that homoios concerns how being applies to both. And that's why I think it's reasonable to draw the conclusion that here the emphasis is on how we predicate being. If we stand to the linguistic level, if we go to the ontological level, the point is how being holds of motion and rest as an attribute. And so in other words, I think that homoios qualifies, and that I think the grammar is pretty straightforward in this regard, qualifies heinai rather than motion and rest primarily. But then I also wanted to say something about the second point, your second remark. I mean, I know you this is a point you have been stressing often. The reason why I'm hesitant about the point you make, I mean, both in papers and in your remark about 249 B12 C1. So your point is that things are cannot be just be simplicator, not be at rest, if separated from stasis, right? Now, one thing that one might object to this is that, I mean, for example, I mean, I don't buy I don't buy the whole of it, but there was one point made by Miles Berniate in his paper on the apology, and in a very general sort of way, that seems to be a reasonable claim to me, that genestai, just like einai, can be used with or without complement. So in this case, I mean, this might be an elliptical use of genestai, right? Genestai. So it might still be the case that things are katatauta kaios autos, kai perito auto, at rest, are at rest, cannot be at rest without being separated from stasis, right? And I mean, I think there are good reasons to think that, just because my impression is that there's quite good evidence throughout the dialogues that Phaedo is committed to a view, to a notion of causality on which something is F due to its combination with what is F by its own nature, right? So the participation with stasis, or the non-separation from stasis, enables something to obtain the property of stasis and not just the property of being. Just like, you know, by partaking in beauty, you are beautiful, right? You get to be beautiful. So I think this reading of supplying genestai with a complement is consistent with a general way of thinking about causality that Plato emphasizes in several dialogues, and in the Sophists too.
Thank you for all the questions. So thank you very much, Roberto.
Yes, please, Colin, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for a really interesting paper. My question is really broad, and I apologize for asking such a broad question, but what I'm wondering is what you mean when you use the phrase "to exist." And the reason that I ask is as follows. So you say that for Plato, to be means to participate in the kind being. And that sounds right to me. And then you say, and all that means is just what we mean when we use this English word "to exist." And that's where I have pause, you know. And so let me just say one or two more quick things, and then I'm curious what you think. So, like, you know, for example, well, obviously English or existence is not a Greek term. It's not clearly in the Greek in any sort of way. And you know, so for example, Santa Claus does not exist. I think that's pretty unambiguous. But yet Santa Claus is something or someone about whom we can have true or false predication. We can make true or false claims. So Santa Claus would be something that would, when we turn to the discussion of true and false speech later in the Sophist, Santa Claus would be something that is, at least in some sense. But you're shaking your head, so you don't disagree. So anyway, so that's my question: is what you mean when you use this term "to exist."
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think I think that's a pretty natural way of thinking about existence, of reflecting on the notion of existence in Plato and ancient philosophy in general, because I mean, perhaps especially after Kant, but in particular after Frege and Russell, the discussion about and after Quine more specifically, the discussions about existence have mostly focused on the problem of non-existent entities, right? Of fictional entities or entities which existed but no longer exist. So about all this cluster of entities or pseudo entities or items that either don't exist at all or might not exist or don't exist anymore, right? I mean, my impression, and even people endorsing the view that I'm resisting, people like Owen, acknowledge pretty clearly that Plato is not at all interested in the topic in a topic like that. I mean, he discusses entities such as the Chimera in the Republic, but it just thinks they are not real unities, but they are just a matter of mental fabrication. So they don't fulfill the requirements that are, and that's why I was shaking my head. They don't fulfill the requirement that the conditions that are set in the sophist for true and false predication, because the true predication must be about a T, right? When we go to 262, 263, that's a pretty clear requirement. So when Plato thinks that the semantic unity of a sentence is guaranteed by its referring to something, he's and assuming, and there is plenty of evidence for that for Plato, unlike the Stoics or Meinong or other philosophers in the history of philosophy, T is not separate from on, right? There is no something which is not also an existent. Then a true subject of predication must be something existent. So the problem is, so when we say that Santa Claus doesn't exist, or Santa Claus, or if we make a predication about Santa Claus, what kind of predication are we making? A possible answer, I think, is the following. On the one hand, that's not a truth evaluable statement. It's not something that we can evaluate as true or false according to the criteria established in the Sophist. The second point is that Plato would have, I think, the resources to break down that statement by saying there is, so you can break down the subject, Santa Claus, and analyze it into false statements by saying, for example, there is a man with a long beard who flies with, the night of on the Christmas night and does this and that, right? That would be a false statement. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that what people, I mean, if we take, for example, Kripke's reference in existence, you'll find there was a famous note in that book where Kripke says that the conundrum of non-existent entities is probably the most important conundrum of recent ontology. My immediate reaction, taking Plato's perspective, would be that that's simply false for Plato. It's not a problem for Plato. At least it's not the problem is addressing in the Sophist. So false predication is not predication about non-existent entities, but it's a different kind of problem.
I think you have to leave it there. Sarah, I would ask you to write to Roberto to pose your question. We don't have more time now. Join me thanking Roberto. Grazie. Credo che passiamo adesso all'italiano. Sì, credo che sì, che Silvio Marino presente in italiano. Dottore Silvio Marino è all'Università di Brasilia, è interessato in filosofia antica, presocratica, Platone, e in speciale il tema del dialogo platonico e medicina antiqua. Lui ha un libro, Il corpo del dialogo, una teoria della comunicazione a partire dal Protagora di Platone, dal Corpus Hippocraticum, e anche un'organizzazione su ekphrasis. Grazie, dottore Silvio Marino, a voi.
Allora, grazie mille. Innanzitutto mi sentite?
Sì, perfetto.
Ok. Allora, vorrei innanzitutto salutare gli amici e ringraziare innanzitutto l'organizzatore Raul. Grazie per l'organizzazione e a tutta l'organizzazione. Vorrei anche salutare Ivana, no? E tutti gli amici che Ivana ieri mi ha salutato con grande affetto e che ricambio e nostalgia purtroppo, no, di questa situazione. E lamento anche il fatto di, pur stando in Brasile, non aver mai incrociato la professoressa Araujo, no? Che comprende l'italiano, anche perché abbiamo dei carissimi amici in comune che sono gli allievi del professore Tulli, Mauro Tulli di Pisa, Michele Corradi, Dino De Sanctis e Mario Regali, il quale Mario Regali sta a Napoli, l'ho sentito e mi ha detto di salutarla, quindi porto gli auguri e i saluti. Io parlerò chiaramente in italiano, ho preparato un paper, un handout che condividerò sullo schermo e mi preparo tassativamente a rispettare i miei 30 minuti e quindi ringrazio tutti. Un attimo solo che cerco il testo e poi di condividere l'handout che ho. Vediamo se posso condividere lo schermo. Penso che sia questo. Si sta vedendo? Perfetto.
Sì.
Allora, lo scopo di questa mia breve comunicazione è quello di mettere in rilievo il concetto di koinonia sul piano dialogico, quello delle interazioni che i dialoganti instaurano e di come essa sia determinante nella costituzione del dialogo, per poi suggerire che la struttura cui Platone pensa per il dialogo sta alla base delle interazioni intrapsichiche e politiche. Innumerevoli sono le occorrenze di koinonia e dei verbi koinō, koinūstai nel corpus platonicum, quindi per cui mi soffermerò solo su alcune di esse perché più di altre mi sembrano atte a mostrare il senso di comunanza, comunità che questi termini portano con sé. Una prima occorrenza di koinonia che vorrei sottoporre alla vostra attenzione è quella che abbiamo nel simposio, una delle tre. Questa occorrenza si ha in un luogo molto importante perché viene prima della celebre scala Amoris. Dopo aver chiarito che chi ama desidera generare e che solo si può generare nel bello, Diotima afferma che chi è gravido nell'anima desidera partorire. Allora cerca il bello in cui poter generare e, cito il primo testo, se si imbatte in un'anima bella e ben dotata per natura, si affeziona molto a questo duplice insieme e di fronte a questo uomo ha immediata facilità di discorsi sulla virtù e su quale deve essere l'uomo buono e di quali cose deve occuparsi e si accinge a educarlo. Venendo a contatto, infatti, credo, con l'uomo bello e frequentandolo, partorisce e genera le cose di cui da tempo era gravido, ricordandosi di lui, presente o assente che sia, e insieme a lui alleva ciò che ha generato, sicché tali uomini hanno tra loro una comunanza molto maggiore che con i figli e un'amicizia più salda, dato che hanno condiviso figli più belli e più immortali. Fine della citazione. A caratterizzare quanto avviene nell'uomo che incontra un'anima bella sono i verbi euporein, paidewein, aptestai. Chiedo un attimo scusa perché c'è una piccola interruzione. Sono i verbi euporein, paidewein, aptestai e koinoneo. Lo spazio semantico che l'accostamento di questi termini crea è propriamente lo spazio del dialegestai. Innanzitutto vi è l'euporein. In questo passo vi è anche la constatazione che quando si riescono a fare con facilità, cioè con euporia, discorsi sulla virtù e su come deve essere la gatossa ner, allora si educa anche. La dimensione del Paidewein è pertanto implicita nel produrre discorsi sulla virtù. Per di più occorre notare che quella che si definisce metafora tattile, ma che sarebbe più corretto a mio avviso considerare nell'ordine di un processo di contatto e di adeguamento di chi tocca verso chi o ciò che è toccato. Il participio aptomenos, e scusatemi, condivido lo schermo, il participio aptomenos dà il senso di un contatto che è un adeguarsi, un conformarsi a ciò con cui si viene in contatto. Questo mi sembra il senso delle occorrenze di questo verbo nel simposio, in cui è il contatto con il bello in sé e non con una sua immagine che garantisce della verità del sapere che si ottiene. Per di più, come il passo sopra citato mostra, questo contatto avviene soltanto con enti eidetici, di cui non è questione per il nostro discorso, ma anche con individui le cui qualità morali e intellettuali permettono di generare bei discorsi sulla virtù. Mi sembra ancora una volta che vi sia un richiamo esplicito alla figura di Socrate, che nel Menone viene paragonato alla torpedine. Tuttavia, se nel simposio questo contatto genera l'euporein, nel Menone genera l'aporein, una aporein di cui lo stesso Socrate, come afferma esplicitamente, è vittima. Che il contatto con il contatto e con il generare i discorsi sulla virtù vi è perciò koinonia, perché si condividono i figli più belli e più immortali. Ed è qui appunto che occorre il termine koinonia rafforzato dal verbo koinoneo alla fine del passo. La comunanza tra questo tipo di uomini è quindi determinata da quanto essi condividono, dalla condivisione ovvero dei discorsi sulla virtù e sulla gatozza ner, il che mi sembra indica con grande chiarezza ancora una volta il piano del dialegestai, in cui la condivisione delle opinioni è la marca di un dialogo condotto correttamente fra persone della stessa ottima natura. Condivisione che è, in termini dialogici e della fine del dialogo, omologia. Koinonia, pertanto, è uno dei termini che rimettono alla dimensione dialogica, così come delineata lungo tutta l'opera di Platone. In altri termini, possiamo immaginare che sul piano delle relazioni umane la koinonia sia l'equivalente, sul piano delle opinioni, della omologia. Questo ci viene suggerito dal passo sopra menzionato del simposio, ovvero la koinonia, così come la omologia, sia al termine del dialogo, quando si è partorito e pertanto condiviso. E che la koinonia sia quella urbanità e quella franchezza, quella disposizione a confutare e a essere confutati, ci viene testimoniato da un altro luogo in cui questo termine, assieme ai relativi verbi della sua famiglia lessicale, individua la corretta comunità dialogica, e questo dialogo è il lachete. In quest'opera Platone utilizza varie volte questo armamentario lessicale per indicare il tipo preciso di sinusia nella quale gli interlocutori sono calati, o dovrebbero esserlo, perché non tutto è pacifico nella discussione dell'achete. La koinonia diviene qui una collaborazione alleanza tra uomini che si promettono amicizia reciprocamente. Il termine occorre 2 volte, e 2 volte occorre anche il verbo anakoinustai, alquanto raro in Platone e nella letteratura coeva, con il senso di condividere il proprio pensiero, di consultarsi con amici circa una questione. E cito il passo numero 2. E leggo. Avete dunque visto combattere l'uomo in armi, Nietzsche all'achete. Il motivo
Scusa Silvio, può mostrare
sì.
il passo 2?
Okay. Grazie, perdonatemi. Il motivo per cui vi abbiamo chiesto, io e Melesia, che è qui, di venirlo a vedere insieme a noi, prima non ve l'abbiamo detto, ma ora ve lo diremo. Crediamo infatti che almeno di fronte a voi sia necessario parlare con tutta franchezza. Paresiazestai. Vi sono in effetti alcuni che ridono di tali esercizi, e qualora una voglia consigliarsi con loro, non dicono ciò che pensano, ma cercando di indovinare quello che ha in mente chi li consulta, dicono cose diverse dalla loro opinione. Paratenauton doxan. Ritenendovi noi, invece, capaci di giudicare e, una volta giudicato, di dire con schiettezza quel che a voi sembra, vi abbiamo perciò chiamato a consiglio sulle questioni di cui vogliamo mettervi a parte. Anakoinustai. Questo passo è l'inizio della chete ed è programmatico quanto al dialogo che si svilupperà e sembra condensare, più che altri luoghi dell'opera di Platone, la concezione del dialegestai come esso debba darsi, quali siano i fini e soprattutto i mezzi per portare a passo e...
Silvio,
Sì?
adesso sì, che
Ok,
non ti capivo.
ok. Tutto a posto adesso? Perfetto.
Sì.
Il verbo anakoinustai chiude questo passo e lo chiude dopo aver enunciato un principio fondamentale affinché il dialogo possa svolgersi in maniera corretta e quindi avere la speranza di giungere a un esito positivo. Questo principio si declina come parresia e come parlare kata tendoxan, secondo ciò che si pensa. Tuttavia l'argomento principale è la cura dei figli. Lisimaco e Melesia invitano Nietzsche e Lachete a prendersi cura dei propri figli assieme a loro. Questo incipit sembra rincorrere i termini della famiglia lessicale di Koinonia, perché dopo anakoinustai occorrono anche koinonos e koinonia. Lisimaco e Melesia si sono portati dietro Nietzsche e Lachete per consultarsi se fosse cosa buona che i figli praticassero il combattimento in armi. E qui cito il passo numero 3. Ci è sembrato dunque necessario andare a vedere quest'uomo e portarci dietro anche voi, sia come spettatori, sia al contempo come consiglieri e compagni compartecipi, qualora lo vogliate, della cura dei figli. Fine citazione. Il termine koinonos prolunga e specifica il senso dell'anakoinustai e prelude all'occorrenza del termine koinonia, ed è il passo numero 4. Lisimaco dice: ora dunque sta a voi consigliarci sia a proposito di questa disciplina, se è necessario impararla o no, sia a proposito di altre, se avete qualche insegnamento o qualche occupazione da raccomandarci per un giovane, e dirci che ne farete nella nostra proposta di associazione, koinonia. La proposta di associazione, comunanza o anche di comunione viene accettata da Nietzsche negli stessi termini in cui è posta da Lisimaco, ed è il testo numero 5. Io per conto mio, Lisimaco e Melesia, approvo il vostro proposito e sono disponibile ad associarmi, koinonein, a voi, e così penso anche la Chete, che è qui con noi. Fine citazione. Ritorna, perdonatemi, ritorna l'insistenza sulla koinonia per mezzo del verbo koinoneo, e oltre alla comunanza, nelle parole di Socrate verso la fine del dialogo, vi è anche la condivisione, ed è il testo numero 6. E cito: nulla me l'impedisce di interrogare Nietzsche, e la ricerca infatti sarà comune per me e per te. Allora dimmi, Nietzsche, o meglio dici: io e la Kate infatti condividiamo il discorso. Dici che il coraggio è scienza delle cose da temere e di quelle da usare? Fine citazione. Questa koinonia passa quindi da un'associazione stabilita al fine di trovare quali siano le occupazioni migliori per l'educazione dei giovani a una associazione condivisione del logos nelle parole di Socrate, e la marca di questa condivisione e comunione è il dare e ricevere ragione, come innumerevoli passi platonici testimoniano, ed è il testo numero 7. Se dunque per voi non fa differenza, parlate ed esaminate insieme con Socrate, dando e ricevendo reciprocamente ragione. Fine citazione. La koinonia del Logos viene ribadita un'altra volta nelle parole di Socrate dopo un battibecco tra Lachete e Nietzsche, in cui Lachete accusa Nietzsche di farsi bello con il discorso, tacciandolo di sofista. Lachete quindi dice a Socrate di esaminare Nietzsche e Socrate ribatte, ed è il testo 8. Cito: sto per farlo, carissimo, ma non credere che ti scioglierò dalla comunanza del discorso, tes koinonias tu logu. Fa attenzione ed esamina con me le cose dette. Fine citazione. La koinonia che quindi si instaura nel dialogo è tale che, pur quando un solo interlocutore si incarica di esaminare un altro interlocutore o una questione, anche chi tace continua a far parte della koinonia, perché l'indagine è sempre in comune. Una notazione che servirà per chiarire un passo che tra poco considereremo si impone perché, come dice Nietzsche in questo stesso dialogo, in realtà l'oggetto di indagine è l'interlocutore stesso. Interlocutore che si manifesta attraverso i logoi che produce, creando quella circolarità tra logoi e bios, che è condizione di possibilità affinché si stabilisca la koinonia, una koinonia che si fonda sì sui logoi fatti assieme, ma che si trasferisce alla vita. Ed è il passo numero 9. Non mi sembra che tu sappia che chi si avvicina molto ai discorsi di Socrate e ha con lui familiarità nel dialogare, di necessità, anche se anche comincia in un primo momento a discutere di qualcos'altro, viene da lui condotto nel discorso in un giro senza tregua, sino a che non finisce con il dare ragione di se stesso, in quale modo ora viva e come abbia vissuto la sua vita trascorsa. Nel gioco di occorrenze di termini fine citazione. Nel gioco di occorrenze di termini della famiglia lessicale di Koinonia, che Platone tesse con arte, ritroviamo nel Protagora il verbo anakoinustai, quando nel secondo prologo di questo dialogo il giovane Ippocrate chiede a Socrate aiuto per incontrare Protagora. Socrate allora cerca di ponderare meglio la cosa e dopo un dialogo che sembra più un interrogatorio, decide di recarsi in casa di Callia dove è ospitato Protagora ed è il testo numero 10. Cito, quindi ora, come ci proponevamo di fare, andiamo a sentire quest'uomo e dopo averlo ascoltato ci consulteremo anche con altri. Là infatti non c'è solo Protagora, ma c'è anche Ippia e credo pure Prodico Diceo, oltre a molti altri sapienti. Fine citazione. Una seconda, e qui il verbo chiaramente è anakoinustai, una seconda occorrenza di anakoinustai si ha in un momento decisivo del dialogo, quando cioè la discussione rischia di terminare. Dopo la discussione sul Carme di Simonide, Protagora sembra non voler più discutere e allora Socrate ribadisce che il suo unico interesse è quello di indagare le cose che lo mettono in difficoltà. E dopo un elogio della sapienza di Protagora chiede, ed è il testo 11. Quindi, perché non, e cito, quindi perché non dovrei invitarti nell'esame di queste cose a interrogarti e a consultarti? Di nuovo, qua è erotan e anakoinustai. Fine citazione. Socrate, nella Chete, cerca di creare quella koinonia con il suo interlocutore, che come abbiamo visto si fonda sui logoi, ma che investe anche il piano della vita. Una spia del fatto che il carattere umano degli interlocutori non sia neutro quanto al dialogo, ci viene da questo stesso dialogo. In una sezione in cui si discute del modo in cui discutere, quando Ippia cerca di riportare l'ordine e la pace con queste parole. E cito il testo 12. O voi qui presenti, io credo che siate tutti congeneri, siungeneis, familiari e concittadini per natura. E lascio da parte per motivi di tempo il resto. Non posso dilungarmi sul concetto di siungeneia all'interno dei dialoghi e soprattutto del Protagora, ma vorrei solo portare all'attenzione il fatto che la koinonia chiaramente non può esserci senza una siungeneia, come attestato in Repubblica 531 CD, senza cioè che gli interlocutori condividano una hexis, la quale hexis non è altro se non la disposizione a dare e ricevere ragione allo scopo di indagare. La questione della siungeneia occorre in un luogo del politico e può chiarirci il legame tra siungeneia degli interlocutori e logoi. E cito il testo 13. Dobbiamo però sempre riconoscere con cura i nostri parenti siungeneis attraverso i discorsi, no? E con dialogon. I discorsi che si fanno rivelano la siungeneia tra gli uomini e questo per un principio che viene affermato nel Teteto e che ribadisce ancora una volta l'indissolubile legame tra il bios, inteso come interiorità, logos di un individuo, e i logoi che tale individuo pronuncia e che sono l'espressione deterministicamente intesa di questa interiorità. E cito il testo 14. Credo invece che a colui che per una cattiva disposizione di anima abbia opinioni congeneri a essa, un'anima in buone condizioni possa far opinare cose conformi ad essa. Le opinioni che un interlocutore ha rispecchiano la sua disposizione psichica ed è per questo che nel politico Socrate può dire che i parenti, nel senso della koinonia, si riconoscono dai logoi ed è ancora per questo stesso motivo che un dialogo corretto può essere condotto se e solo se gli interlocutori parlano kata doxan, come vuole il Lachete, non nascondendo quanto pensano, disposti a dialogare dialecticoteron, come si dice nel Menone, no? In una maniera più dialettica, dialogica, diremmo noi, perché è solo dai logoi che si può riconoscere la syungeneia umana, intellettuale e morale tra gli uomini. Dopo aver specificato la relazione tra koinonia e syungeneia sul piano dialogico, vorrei soffermarmi, ma davvero brevissimamente per lasciare spazio a una discussione, su altri due piani in cui questa struttura agisce, ovvero su quello psichico e su quello politico. Che la koinonia sia un concetto politico non c'è dubbio. Il senso di associazione privata o pubblica è attestato in moltissimi luoghi. Quanto perciò vorrei mostrare è che il concetto di koinonia che abbiamo visto all'opera all'interno del dialogo, nel farsi del dialegestai, occupa una posizione, un livello mediano tra ciò che è più piccolo e ciò che è più grande. Mi riferisco al piano dell'anima e al piano della polis. Quanto a livello dell'anima e del corpo vorrei mostrare soltanto alcune occorrenze. Per quanto riguarda l'anima nella Repubblica, il verbo koinoneo occorre durante la dimostrazione della differenza tra thumoides ed epitiumeticon, ed è il testo 15, e cito. E non ci accorgiamo, anche in molti altri casi dissi, che quando i desideri fanno violenza a qualcuno contrastando la sua capacità di ragionamento, questi si rimprovera e si adira contro la parte violenta di sé e, come se vi fossero due contendenti, la collera di chi si trova in questa situazione si allea con la ragione, che invece essa si accomuni ai desideri, mentre la ragione cerca di convincerla a non contrastarla, questo non credo che tu possa dire di esserti mai accorto che accadesse in te stesso e penso neanche in altri. Fine della citazione. Il passo mostra alquanto chiaramente che la koinonia non è come una comunanza qualsiasi, ma una comunanza associazione che è secondo natura, kata fusin. Socrate dice che non vi è una koinonia tra thumoides ed epitiumeticon. Certo, potrebbe anche essere che egli si riferisca a Glaucone come a un gennaios, no? Come vuole per esempio Mario Veggetti. Ma in Repubblica 531 CD è chiara l'equivalenza tra syungeneia e koinonia. E quindi possiamo inferire che vi è sì una koinonia tra logisticon e thumoides, ma non tra thumoides ed epitiumeticon, perché questa unione è contro natura. Del resto, sempre a livello dell'anima, poter stabilire con gli altri uomini una koinonia è una delle caratteristiche del filosofo della Callipolis, e cito il testo 16. Nella ricerca dell'anima filosofica o meno, osserverai inoltre fin dalla prima giovinezza questo aspetto, se essa sia giusta e mite oppure non socievole e selvaggia. E qua è dius koinonetos. Fine citazione. Questa polarizzazione tra giustizia e mitezza da un lato e incapacità a stringere koinonia e selvatichezza dall'altro, no? Possiamo dire con questa polarizzazione che come nel passo precedente in Repubblica 440 AB, la koinonia alla quale Platone sta pensando sia già di per sé connotata come facente parte dell'orizzonte semantico formato da giustizia e da mitezza. In altre parole, la ricerca dell'anima filosofica si risolve nella ricerca dell'interlocutore modello, colui che ha una disposizione verso gli altri a dialogare e ad associarsi. Per quanto riguarda il corpo, il termine koinonia è usato per indicare la comunanza che il corpo ha con l'anima. in relazione al dolore, perché se si ha dolore in una parte è tutto il corpo e l'anima assieme a risentirne. Si delinea in questo modo il concetto di organismo, perlomeno un primo abbozzo, e possiamo intravedere anche in questo caso che la koinonia indica un intero, un holon, con tutto ciò che a questa concezione consegue. Tuttavia, proprio dalla koinonia di dolore e piacere che individua la comunità in cui i legami tra gli individui sono i più forti, possiamo ritrovare a livello politico il senso di koinonia che abbiamo tracciato in relazione al dialogo. E quanto più mette conto notare è il fatto che il termine koinonia occorre in tutta la Repubblica da 333, ma in 371b questi termini spariscono fino a 411. Ovvero, quando Socrate discute della città infiammata, phlegmainusa, il termine koinonia non viene usato. Non mi sembra questo un dato peregrino, soprattutto in relazione a quanto messo in evidenza prima, ovvero al fatto che la koinonia politica è innanzitutto una koinonia emotiva. Nel simposio, un'altra occorrenza sembra legare la koinonia emotiva, in questo caso erotica, alla politica, al legame politico di azione nella città, e il passo è in 182 BC ed è l'ultimo passo, il 17, e cito. Nella Ionia, invece, e in molti altri luoghi governati dai barbari, si è stabilita la norma che è brutto, in quanto è considerato brutto concedere favori agli amanti dai barbari a causa dei loro governi tirannici. E così è anche per l'amore del sapere e l'amore della ginnastica. Non è utile, infatti, per chi ha il potere, credo, che nei sudditi si ingenerino alti pensieri e forti amicizie e comunanze, koinoniei, cose che solitamente sono prodotte soprattutto dall'amore. E di fatto lo impararono anche i nostri tiranni. E qui c'è da dire che c'è la citazione di Armodio, dei tirannicidi, Armodio Aristogitone, e c'è da dire un'altra cosa che mi sembra molto importante, ovvero che qua Platone sta dicendo una cosa, che l'amore, la comunanza, tutte queste belle cose, no? In realtà si possono generare non nei regimi non tirannici, e mi sembra una ripresa di Erodoto, del quinto libro di Erodoto, capitolo 78, e di Aria, Acque e Luoghi, dal capitolo 12 in poi, in cui viene criticata la tirannide perché produce degli uomini vili, codardi. Vorrei concludere quindi, e termino adesso, brevemente in questo senso. La koinonia che si instaura nel dialegestai è possibile innanzitutto per opera di una disposizione dell'anima. Un dialogo condotto correttamente, e cioè con degli interlocutori che discutono dialecticoteron, come vuole il Menone, giunge a una omologia che è, almeno nei termini di Gorgia 487 e 67, il conseguimento della verità. La koinonia riguarda pertanto la parte patica dell'anima, ma è soltanto attraverso la koinonia che si può sperare di giungere a una euporia, no? O a una definizione, alla risoluzione di qualcosa. Questo schema di interazione, ciò che lega i vari interlocutori, è quindi quella disposizione a condividere con l'altro l'impresa comune della ricerca. Tale disposizione mi sembra ciò che fonda la koinonia a livello politico nella Repubblica, con il rilievo dato alla koinonia di piacere e dolore. La koinonia dialogica, pertanto, risulta sì ciò che fonda il dialogo, ma il modello di essa è ciò che fonda la possibilità dell'unità della polis, così come dell'anima, perché si ha koinonia solo se secondo natura. E qui mi fermo e vi ringrazio per l'attenzione.
Grazie Silvio. We can have 10 minutes for questions. If anyone has questions, please raise your hand.
Un attimo solo che posso. Ok.
Sì, senza problema. E domande? Un momento che. Ok.
Spero di essere stato chiaro nell'italiano.
Sì, no, chiarissimo.
Ok.
Se posso faccio io una domanda adesso mentre aspettiamo un po'. Provo a fare in italiano, non so come sai
A
in
me va
italiano,
bene
però,
anche in portoghese.
no, vabbè. Però la domanda è così, che si dialogo, c'è bisogno la coinonia per il dialogo, e che la coinonia è una disposizione emotiva, è una disposizione emotiva para ricevere e dare discorsi. È una disposizione anche che credo io è basata in una certa educazione, in una certa educazione morale dell'emozione, pare che affinché possiamo sentire e stare disposti alla rifutazione e a presentare le nostre opinioni. La mia domanda è un po' come si può educare per si arrivare a questa posizione? Perché e questo è, mi pare essere il problema, il dramma nel mezzo della Repubblica, che è come è l'arché di questa coinonia, di questa comunità, perché se tutti fossero così, sarebbero
Perfetto.
tutti giusti e amici. E
Beh,
adesso è come se non è parte della funzione dialogica di fare l'educazione per questo dialogo.
oh, grazie mille per la domanda. Rispondo con una citazione da Ernst Bloch del Principio Speranza, perché tutto più capitolo 36 sulla storia delle utopie comincia: tutto sarebbe più facile se l'erba si potesse mangiare. Tutto sarebbe più facile se tutti condividessero una stessa hexis, no? Disposizione a dialogare. Come si fa questa cosa? Beh, è chiaro, innanzitutto nella Repubblica, per esempio, e mi riferisco alla Repubblica, per esempio, è chiaro che là c'è un problema di circolarità viziosa e c'è il concetto di teia tiuche, teia moira, no? Che a un certo punto questa cosa arriva, insomma c'è un momento che sembra che, per riprendere, no, quel libro famoso del biologo Jacques Monod, no? La necessità, la nécessité ou l'hasard, no? Cioè, nel senso che qual è il principio biologico? Il principio biologico è che una mutazione nel genoma di una specie, poi, che è un caso, a un certo punto diviene la necessità, cioè si riproduce. Questo storicamente, secondo me, perché il problema non è soltanto teorico o teoretico nella Repubblica, è un problema storico, di prassi politica, come fare questo. C'è questa spiegazione. Adesso, il problema, secondo me, è chiaramente è circolare, anche non solo nella Repubblica, ma anche nel dialogo con i sofisti. Cioè, nel senso, se io ho, se io ho sto in una società e ascolto i discorsi, e nel Protagora, no, di Platone, c'è nel secondo prologo con i giovani Ippocrate, si dice che i logoi sono i cibi dell'anima, ma noi non possiamo controllare questi cibi dell'anima. Perfetto, una volta che li compriamo li dobbiamo mangiare e poi pregare, no? Esatto. Ma il problema è che questi logo, in realtà, che noi sentiamo dai sofisti, noi non li sentiamo soltanto dai sofisti, noi li sentiamo nella città. E questo è il problema del libro ottavo della Repubblica, della mutazione dei tipi umani. Perché un ragazzo nato da un padre timocratico diventa oligarchico? Perché? Perché ascolta i discorsi della madre, della balia, questi discorsi entrano, no? Vedono, entrano, fanno parte della propria costituzione psichica, hanno una dunamis propria questi discorsi, e l'uomo da timocratico diventa oligarchico. Questo è il problema. Io non, diciamo, non saprei rispondere, diciamo, forse altrimenti nella pratica, proprio, cioè nel senso, perché il problema è questo. Il problema è quello del dialeghe, cioè nel senso di essere già in una condizione, in una disposizione, chiaramente, che non è né sofistica, quindi di incantamento, di chelesis, e una disposizione che non è eristica, no? Quella di Eutidemo e Dionisodoro, no? Della vittoria negli agoni di discorsi. Diciamo, se il clima è questo, è chiaro che il rischio per un, una degenerazione chiaramente del ragazzo dei discorsi si ha. C'è un però. C'è un però. Nel secondo, e mi riferisco al Protagora, nel secondo prologo del Protagora, Socrate, no, prima di entrare in casa di Callia, parla con il giovane Ippocrate. Il giovane Ippocrate dopodiché scompare completamente dalla scena. Cosa si saranno detti? Probabilmente possiamo pensare che Socrate abbia dato un antidoto al veleno sofistico di Protagora. Questa è la mia... cioè i discorsi dei sofisti si combattono attraverso dei discorsi corretti. Dei discorsi, tra l'altro, che sono indicati nel Phaedo, cioè nel senso Socrate conosce l'anima del giovane Ippocrate e da bravo, diciamo, retore, fra virgolette, riesce a dare a quell'anima particolare il giusto discorso, no? Dove c'è la famosa citazione di Ippocrate, il discorso vero a 269-270. Questo è quello che posso pensare.
Grazie.
Prego.
Roberto.
Sì, grazie Silvio. Solo una piccola domanda. Vorrei capire bene se rispetto a quanto dicevi sul rapporto fra omologia e koinonia, se ritieni che la koinonia sia una condizione o un fine, uno scopo del dialogo.
Sì. Posso
Cioè,
rispondere?
questa è la domanda, cioè
Sì.
se senti che sia una condizione o
Sì,
che sia
sì.
il punto d'arrivo, sia lo scopo.
Beh, è come dicevamo prima, no? C'è il problema della circolarità, perché già si deve avere una disposizione, diciamo, già si deve condividere qualche cosa all'interno. Io quello che penso è che sia la exis, la disposizione, no? Il passo là nel Menone 275, no? In cui, no, si dice, beh, bisogna discutere più dialetticoteron, in maniera più dialettica, fra virgolette, perché non si tratta di dialettica, ma dialogica, no? Bisogna, diciamo, andare incontro all'altro interlocutore se davvero si vuole discorrere. Dopodiché si entra nel dialogo e, come il Lachet dimostra, è una, diciamo, la koinonia è una precondizione, può essere considerata sia precondizione sia, diciamo, risultato, secondo me, come quello che si deve condividere certamente all'inizio è una exis, una disposizione a dare e ricevere ragione. Adesso, quanto alla omologia, no? Io l'ho detto prima, no? Come fine del dialogo, come esito del dialogo. Il problema è che il problema è che la omologia è una può aversi solo alla fine. C'è un altro verbo, no, che si traduce in genere con accordo, accordarsi, che è synchorein. Ma synchorein indica, diciamo, un accordo previo per poter andare, per svolgere il dialogo. Dopodiché la omologia viene. Come lo intendo io questa cosa? Io la intendo come, diciamo, e come anche Platone ci dice, nel dialogo, in un vero dialogo, non vince la posizione di una persona, a vincere è sempre il logos. E quindi quando noi discutiamo in realtà e arriviamo a una soluzione, la soluzione, diciamo, di un problema, la definizione, per quanto chiaramente possa essere aporetico, il punto di arrivo, no? Cioè questa omologia, alla fine non è data da qualcuno, ma è in comune. Cioè questo il vero, diciamo, problema per Platone, il fatto che io non ti devo persuadere dall'esterno, perché in questo modo io farei lo stesso lavoro del sofista. Io ti incanterei, ti metterei dentro l'anima una mia opinione e tu la condividi, come anche Gorgia. Cioè la persuasione è questo, insomma, e Elena se ne va con Paride. Perfetto. La omologia invece è alla fine, si ha alla fine del dialogo in cui il logos, diciamo così, nasce, no? Nell'anima, diciamo, ci si accorda, ma è il dialogo, diciamo, è la soluzione del dialogo, del logos, chiaramente. E questo non soltanto da un punto di vista dialogico, ma anche da un punto di vista dialettico, possiamo dire. No? Pensiamo per esempio al Parmenide, all'ultima sezione del Parmenide, insomma, in cui praticamente noi ci accordiamo sulle cose, quello può essere qualsiasi cosa, ma il problema è che cambiano le relazioni, cambiano le impostazioni.
Grazie.
We'll have to interrupt here. Perdón, Ivana, no tenemos más tiempo. Después escribe a Silvio.
Grazie, Ivana.
Grazie, Silvio.
Grazie a voi.
We're shifting to English now. I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Travis Butler, professor of the University of Iowa State University. Professor Butler works on Plato's epistemology, has a recent paper on Socrates and philosophical practice, another one on asceticism on the Phaedo, and he's talking to us today on the Phaedo. The title is Koinonia and Immanence in the Phaedo, Lessons from the Body and Soul Case. Professor Butler, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to try to share the screen here. Are we good?
No, we cannot see your file. Now we can. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to try to move through the first part pretty quickly. I'm going to start with a pretty familiar kind of tension, I think. So on the one hand, there's what we might call the general conception of forms in the Phaedo, where the forms have these kind of fancy qualities. The ones that I'm going to focus on are pure and aloneness. And so alone by itself is the translation I'm going to use for auto kathoto. And then on the other hand, of course, when he talks about forms as itai, then he says, he offers us koinonia or parousia for possible ways of cashing that out. And so to see that there might be some kind of tension there, at 67C, purity and aloneness get connected really directly to separation, right? So on the one hand, he seems to be saying forms are separate, but on the other hand, he seems to be saying that forms are in association with sensibles and present to sensibles, and so on, okay? Now, I'm not saying that's a contradiction. I'm just saying there seems to be some kind of tension there, and we would need to kind of think about some kind of solution. So what are our options for resolving the tension? I think one thing that maybe some people do is just sort of deny that he really means that forms are present in the sensible world. So opt for some kind of non-literal meaning or something, or perhaps point to the end of the passage where Socrates says, I'm not going to insist on the details here. The only thing I'm going to insist on is that beautiful things are beautiful by beauty itself. And of course, that is so formal that that it doesn't entail that the forms are in the sensible world. So you might just sort of say he's not really committed to the idea that forms are present, and so that's how we resolve the apparent tension. The second strategy is to try to explain how A and 1A and B are both true in sort of common sense interpretations of what they mean. So the second strategy is sort of trying to do justice to both of these claims by developing some kind of interpretive solution. So one person who does this, I think, is Gail Fine, who just kind of straightforwardly argues that forms are present in the sensible world. And so I'm going to try to maybe provide some maybe kind of secondary support for that kind of reading. So to pursue that second option, what I'm going to do is examine some things that he says about koinonia in the soul-body case for any evidence that might bear on the form-sensible case. And of course, it'll just be worth looking at the soul-body case in its own right? But maybe it can also be illuminating for this issue about the tension between these different conceptions of forms. You might be worried about that methodology, right? You might ask, why should one think that studying the soul-body case is going to be illuminating for the form-sensible case? Here I don't have a proof, but I would just say, there's the idea that forms and souls are sumgenes, that they belong to the same kind. And so I think that might at least give us some kind of prima facie reason to think that the rules for koinonia might be similar in the two cases, since they belong to the same kind. And so specifically what I'm going to ask is, in the case of the soul, what kind of koinonia is it that compromises purity and aloneness? Okay, because if we could find out what kind of koinonia compromises purity and aloneness in the case of the soul, then maybe that would tell us whether forms standing in that kind of koinonia would necessarily compromise their purity and aloneness. Okay, so that's sort of the idea, right? That not that this is going to provide a standard of proof for the form-sensible case, but maybe it will just be illuminating because of the kinship between souls and forms. Okay. So I'm just going to give a definition of what I will call metaphysical koinonia. And so define metaphysical koinonia this way, that X is in koinonia is associating with a sensible object such that it and the sensible are present in the same place. Okay. So there are, problems that you might raise about thinking about forms in a place or something like that. I'm hoping that this will be okay with people. I'm just kind of trying to capture what I think of as the core idea or the core question we're asking when we're asking about immanence, right? We're asking, are forms really present in the sensible world? Or is everything in the sensible world just some kind of imitation, right? And there is a little bit of evidence for talking this way, because you might remember at 79e to 80, when he's talking about the obligation that the soul has to rule over the body, he starts that off by saying, when the soul and the body are together in the same place, then the soul has this obligation to rule over the body and to master it and so on, right? And I take it there the contrast is probably with the afterlife, right? When if you do it right, then in the afterlife, your soul won't be with the body anymore. So I'm using that as some kind of textual warrant for talking this way about being compresent with sensible objects in the same place, even though, of course, one could raise objections about that idea, okay? So then to kind of retranslate my question is metaphysical koinonia sufficient to compromise purity and aloneness? If it is sufficient to compromise purity and aloneness, then that would be a reason to think that forms don't stand in that. Because I think it's obviously really important for forms that they turn out to be pure and alone by themselves, right? I think that's a commitment that Plato isn't going to want to give up, at least in the Phaedo. And so if it turns out that metaphysical koinonia is sufficient to compromise purity and aloneness, then that at least gives us some reason for thinking that whatever Plato means by koinonia in 103d, he probably, or maybe he doesn't mean the metaphysical sense. Maybe it's just a kind of teleological causation or something like that, okay? So I'm going to look at the case of the soul and ask this question about sufficiency for compromise. So there are, I think, three primary passages where he talks about soul, body, koinonia. The first two are in the context of the kind of pessimistic passages. So the 65c passage, the passages in the 60s are basically saying the body disturbs the soul whenever it's in koinonia with it. So we should try to avoid koinonia with the body as far as possible and so on, okay? Then I'm going to talk about the 80e passage in a minute. So there are some passages in the Phaedo that suggest that metaphysical koinonia does compromise purity and aloneness in the case of the soul. And again, by metaphysical koinonia, I just mean this idea that the things are together in the same place, right? So you'll probably recognize this argument. Socrates attributes it to the people who people who philosophize in the genuine way, or whatever, however we want to translate that. And so I've simplified the argument. The soul can attain pure wisdom only if it can be alone by itself, but the embodied soul cannot be alone by itself, so the embodied soul cannot attain pure wisdom, okay? And if you read through that passage, at least according to me, the fundamental problem in this passage is the claim, the fundamental problem for the soul when it's embodied is that it can't be alone by itself. That's why we can't satisfy our desire for wisdom and truth and so on, okay? So that makes it sound like, in premise 2, like it really is just metaphysical koinonia that compromises purity and aloneness. Because if you can't ever be alone as long as you have a body, then it makes it sound like, oh, it's really the metaphysical relation that causes the problem, okay? It's just kind of embodiment itself. And I think a lot of people, maybe most people, think that that is the view, and that is the view throughout the Phaedo, okay? I just want to suggest maybe a slightly different idea that might come into the dialogue later. And then, you know, I have some thoughts about why there might be this kind of change, but I'm not sure I'll have time to get into that. But so in the eschatology, there's this somewhat surprising necessary condition, right? That achieving the best afterlife actually requires having the soul completely purified, okay? If you don't reach that standard, then the best you can do is you end up on the surface of the earth in the afterlife, which is good, but you hold on to your body and you eventually die and come back either as a social animal or maybe a human being again. But it's not obvious how you're going to be able to achieve complete purification, right? Given the argument in the first bit. And so here's where the passage, the 80E 2 through 5 passage comes in, okay? In that passage, he's again talking about the eschatology, and he says, let's focus on the case of the pure soul, the soul that's not gonna bring anything bodily with it to the afterlife. And his explanation for how that happened is that he says, because the soul had no willing koinonia with the body during life, where willing is hekusa, okay? So in the eschatology, the way to avoid impurity is to avoid willing koinonia. Okay. So just a kind of neat point of detail here. I think one thing that's happening in the Phaedo, right, is that Socrates' own explanations of these concepts like imprisonment, the soul being imprisoned in the body, and purity and impurity, he's following his own rules about how to explain stuff by appealing not to metaphysical relations, but rather to people's choices, right? Their hieresis, which is what he says in the autobiographical passage, right? He says, don't tell me that the cause of my staying in prison is the stuff about my bones and my sinews. The cause of my staying in prison is my choice and my belief about the best, right? And so I think part of what's happening here is that Socrates is saying, it isn't just being embodied that causes impurity, it's your choices. And so it's willing koinonia that causes impurity, not just metaphysical koinonia. Okay, so you might say, however, well, that doesn't help at all, because anytime we choose to associate with the body, that's going to be willing. And so we're always going to end up with impurity anyway, because as long as we are embodied, we can't avoid bodily activity altogether, right? And again, maybe that's right, but I'll just suggest a different view, which is that some things that we choose to do that are bodily, they won't count as willing, provided that they're things that are necessary for continued life and continued practice as a philosopher. Okay. And my justification for that is that if you look at the rules for living the philosophical life, the rules always have a qualifier, right? The rules always say, avoid bodily desires and pleasures except as necessary. Withdraw from the senses except as it's necessary to use them for this or that, right? And so that tells me that that some bodily activity is actually ethically acceptable because some of it is necessary. So those kinds of bodily activities do not violate the ethical rules. And because they don't violate the ethical rules, they're not sources of impurity. So as long as we're choosing to associate with the body only when necessary, then those cases do not count as willing. And so they don't cause any impurity. And so that's how it turns out to be possible that you can actually turn out to have a completely pure soul, even though you're still embodied. Because so long as you limit yourself to bodily activities that are necessary, you haven't violated the rule to avoid all willing koinonia with the body. Okay. So the summary of the soul-body case, I'm claiming, this is highly controversial, but I'm claiming, the soul can stand in metaphysical koinonia to the body without compromising purity and aloneness by avoiding all willing koinonia with the body. Okay. Now that's an extremely high standard, of course, but that's what we want, right? I mean, remember in the Phaedo, there's all the stuff about how, well, there are very few true philosophers, right? Most people are sort of the pretenders. So I think it's okay if the standard is very high. Okay, last part. If that's right, then the soul provides a model for how the forms could really be present in the sensible world without compromising purity and aloneness. Because it isn't metaphysical koinonia that compromises purity and aloneness, it's only willing koinonia. And the forms aren't going to be present to the sensibles by virtue of some kind of act of will, but rather by some kind of necessity or something like that, or because it's best. And so, just as in the case of the soul, it's at least possible for Plato to say forms can be really present to sensibles while still being pure and alone by themselves, because there's no willing koinonia here. There's some other kind of explanation in terms of necessity or or teleology. Okay. How does this help Plato? Well, it addresses this tension in his conception of the forms in the Phaedo, right? So we don't have to assume that he didn't really mean to say koinonia and parousia, because those don't have to threaten purity and aloneness. So you can have all of this stuff that he seems to want. And secondly, it gives him a response to one of Aristotle's criticisms. So I've simplified the argument a little bit, but it's something like, this is Aristotle's argument: forms can be the essences of each thing only if they are in the sensible world, but forms are not in the sensible world, so they can't be the essences of each thing. If what I've said is at least on the right track, then Plato might have the resources for rejecting P2 by saying that just being in the sensible world doesn't compromise purity and aloneness. And so forms can be in the world and present to sensibles while still hanging on to their fancy qualities, like purity and aloneness. Okay. So that was really what I had.
So should we open to questions then? Thank you, Professor Butler. We are open to questions. Question period. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Sarah, do you have your hand raised? Okay, so go ahead, because it's hard to see.
I haven't figured out how to actually raise my hand under reactions. I can't find it. I'm not sure how crucial this is. But I wondered how much of your argument requires reading what would happen to your argument if you didn't read ento auto at 79 to 80? If you didn't read that as in the same play,
Yeah.
then if you read it in the same manner, in the same circumstance,
Sure.
do you something that might avoid being insensible?
The other option that I was considering
that was my only question.
The other option I was considering was just talking about so part of the problem in formulating the thesis I'm interested in is that whatever the relationship between the forms and the sensibles is going to be, it's probably going to be different from the relationship between the soul and the body. And so it was hard for me to find some single way of talking about that. I was going to say stands in some metaphysical relation such that they are joined to each other or something like that. But I found that so the short answer is that I think it would be fine. I think I would have to introduce some somewhat more technical way of talking about it, such that I wasn't saying that forms and sensibles stand to each other in the exact same way as the soul and body do, but that what I'm trying to say is that the relationship is similar in the sense that that at least on the strong reading of Koinonia and Parousia, that the form really is together there with the sensible. It's not together in the same way as the soul body, but it's similar in the sense that the invisible entity is right there with the visible entity.
Can I follow up, or is there?
Quick follow-up. We have another question after you, but a quick follow-up. Go ahead.
But okay, sorry. But it seems like if that isn't translated as in the same place, then the support for because that's the relation between body and soul, right? So we end up with a relation between body and soul that also doesn't give you quite as strong a connection between visible and invisible. They're still not physically together in the same place. That was my concern. Does that change?
Yeah, so I guess I was assuming that would be the easy case, that there is some kind of clear sense in which the soul is kind of in the body, and so I was thinking that although again, you know, the notion of place and so on is maybe awkward, but I was thinking that that would, the soul body case would be the easy case, because I think at least I think it's fairly clear that souls are in the sensible world while they're embodied. Do you agree with that?
I'm not sure. I have to think about it, but I'm going to follow you.
Yeah. So I mean, it's good that you're making this explicit. So what I was thinking was the soul body case, but I was perhaps being too flippant about this. So I was thinking that the soul body case is a case where we do have an invisible entity, the soul, which is in some sense located in the sensible world, because it is in some sense in the body, joined to the body, and it's subject to all of this necessitation by the body, right? There's all those ananke words in the Phaedo. So it's subject to this kind of material necessitation. And that's, of course, part of the imprisonment metaphor. And so given that it seemed to me to be fairly natural to talk about the soul while it's embodied being in the sensible world. And so the question then is the relationship between forms and sensibles similar enough to that, such that forms are also in the sensible world? Although, of course, the relation wouldn't be just the same. It would be some kind of other metaphysical relation different from embodiment.
We now have a presidential question. Professor Halper.
You've raised expectations that I can't hope to fulfill, but this is just a little question. So, and picking up on where you left off about the soul, and when he's talking about the soul, it looks like it's a kind of intermediate between life and the body, and it's in the same context that he talks about fire and snow as being in things because hot and cold maybe wouldn't be. So that's my question. What about these passages that look like there are some sort of intermediates that are actually present in sensibles, and they would allow the forms not to actually be insensibles themselves? And looking back at your principal passage, which I think was 100D 5 and 6, he's pretty cagey about how forms are going to be causes there. He says, well, maybe it's parousia, maybe it's koinonia, or maybe it's some other way. It's however it is they get. So it looks like he's leaving himself plenty of room to come in the next page to make a distinction between largeness itself and the largeness in us. And that that seems to avoid the problem. So I would just want to ask you, what's wrong with that solution? What am I missing?
Yeah. Yes. So that's a fair question. I guess I think I don't have a I think I don't have a great answer about what to say about the immanent characters, because my inclination is to say, well, that's going to be a view that that doesn't get you the forms being present to the sensibles.
That's the point.
But then your response is, well, he doesn't really say they are. He says, I don't really care what the relation is, but maybe it's parousia or koinonia. Right. So I guess part of my reluctance about going straight to the immanent characters is that that is a way of saying he didn't really mean parousia and koinonia. And so it seems to me to be undesirable for that reason.
Well, he says ete parousia, ete koinonia, ete hope kai hopos pros genomene. So it looks like, that's one of them. Maybe it's parousia, maybe it's koinonia, maybe it's just whatever way they happen to be present. And that last part, which you didn't quote, that looks like it would accommodate the immanent characters. And maybe they're not distinct from koinonia or even part. Maybe they're all the same. I think he's just not, it's just not a definite passage, that's all.
Right. So this is the strategy that I suggested at the beginning, where, some people just say, well, he didn't really mean that the forms are present. And so because I think in a way, right, it's not enough just to point to the immanent characters, because you would need to then say, and the immanent characters are some distinct entity from the form. Yeah. There's some kind of imitation, right?
The soul, or that's the way that the forms come to be present by this kind of intermediary, the immanent character, which are somehow imitating the forms.
Right. And so I guess to some extent, the thought behind the paper was, what if you don't want to say that? And is there a way, and this is sort of what Gail Fine does, right? She takes a strong reading of immanence and just argues that it really is the forms that are immanent and not the immanent characters. And so, I'm not appealing to her as an authority. I'm just saying, my thought was, if you want to say either that the forms themselves are present, or that the eminent characters really are something like a part of a form, then what I've said today gives you an ability to say that without necessarily having it compromise purity and aloneness.
So one last question, then I'll shut up here, let somebody else. But how would that work with fire and snow, where there isn't? I mean, the soul. Okay, you may give an account of that, but fire and snow, aren't they present somehow in the things imminently? Are you going to say their forms as well? And how come?
Sorry, I'm not.
Well, you said the soul could somehow avoid being present by not having a willing association with the body. So I'm wondering, how about fire?
Oh no, the soul is present, but its presence doesn't have to compromise its purity.
How about fire? Is it just pure, and its presence doesn't compromise its purity because it can't change? Or what would you say about it?
I mean, I guess I was thinking that like the relevant form would be the hot or something. And the idea would be that the hot, the form, could be present to fire, the fire we experience in a sensible world, while remaining pure and alone by itself, even though it's present to everyday fire. That's how I understand the analogy of the soul.
How about but the soul is sort of analogous to the fire. So I'm wondering, would you say the same thing about the fire? The fire is present to a body, making it hot, and it is not compromised somehow by the body. Is that?
If there's a form of fire that is present to sensible fire, I mean, I read fire in that passage as talking about everyday fire, and that the form there is the hot. If he's talking about a form at all there, he's talking about the hot.
Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, we don't have more time. I will apologize, Tom Tozo. Please write to Professor Butler with your question. We really don't have more time this evening. So, hi. So I'll introduce our last speaker of today, Professor Eric Sanday of the University of Kentucky. He is an expert in ancient Greek philosophy. He has a book called A Study of Dialectic in Plato's Parmenides. He also have a volume on the laws that he organized, and a collection of essays on ancient philosophy too, along with many other papers. Professor Sanday would talk to us about ethical and metaphysical senses of Koinonia. Eric, it's your turn. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolina. So I'm going to start reading. I want in this paper presentation to ask about the distinction between ethical and metaphysical senses of Koinonia. In the end, my conclusion is that there is a good reason to avoid applying a metaphysical framework to what I'm going to refer to as interpersonal erotic life. But I have two qualifications. The first is that dialectical study of the soul and the city and in the Philebus and Statesman clearly do employ a metaphysical framework to understand important aspects of life. I'm not going to discuss those dialogues at all today. So I just have to leave that out. The second qualification is that by interpersonal erotic life, I I don't have in mind the sense of koinonia as partnership, but specifically the types of charged encounters that are thematized in the Phaedrus and Symposium, which I suppose one might think eros of that sort, one might think is outside the scope of social koinonia. So I'm gonna sort of argue a weaker point and a stronger point. One is that interpersonal erotic life can't be explained in terms of participation. I think that's the easier claim. And then I have some suggestions to make about the stronger claim that erotic life is a necessary complement to the dialectical study of metaphysical koinonia. So that's going to be the tougher one. First, I'm going to start by talking about interpreting Platonic dialogues. But Carolina, let me ask something. There is a dog barking next door. Is it distracting?
No, it's fine. We can hear you fine.
Okay, good. Thank you. Plato, I think, makes, well, maybe this is obvious, makes interpreting the dialogue somewhat difficult. It's hard to know how to carve up a dialogue because seemingly distinct themes are so tightly interwoven that they resist being separated from one another. It's also the case that he has his characters pose conclusions provisionally, and sometimes the very subject under discussion can be hard to agree on. He also, I think, measures his arguments to their context in a way that makes it tricky to use the evidence that you draw from one location as the basis for any conclusions in another location without some care. And finally, he stages the dramatic context of these dialogues in such a way that it seems, at least, that self-examination is an important part of what philosophy consists of, but it can be hard to make a definite case about self-examination. So let me just say a bit more about these themes. First, the first one was interweaving of distinct ideas or distinct concerns in the dialogues. We can, I think, choose to focus on questions of epistemology, questions of metaphysics, so on, philosophy of language ethics. But I think these divisions maybe reflect more on us than they do on Plato, especially if we want to try to treat one subject in isolation from the others. For my purposes today, it's a challenge to know how to measure the account of metaphysical koinonia in the Parmenides and Sophist, specifically in relation to the ethical questions in those dialogues. But I think those, Plato writes those dialogues in a way that more or less requires us to consider the ethical issues involved. And so knowing how the ethical question is supposed to affect or shape the metaphysical question, that to me is a challenge. Intertextual references just make the problem worse. Today, I also will allow myself the freedom to refer between a few texts without doing much work to establish that we can make these intertextual references, just because I just want to make one point and I don't have any more time. So the second thing I was mentioning about difficulty of interpreting Plato was the provisionality of conclusions. The conclusions reached in the dialogue are often explicitly provisional, open to further testing, or implicitly contingent on contextual specifics. The conclusions point beyond themselves, invite us to go further, to say more, without telling us where to go or what to say. And so you might think that the thing we should be focused on is just forming the questions that the dialogues pose, as opposed to a systematic or doctrinal understanding of what Plato thought. Certainly some take that approach. I think we should at least be asking that question. And then on top of that, the specific example that's relevant to me today about contested starting points, no better example, I think, than the second part of the Parmenides, where some very structured analysis of metaphysical problems is going on. But, hardly anyone can agree what the subject even is of the hypotheses, hen, which is remarkable. It's incredible. We don't even know where to begin until after we've done a significant amount of work to decide what we're even talking about. So that's just to sum up. Interpreting dialogues, I think, can put us in a bit of a bind. If we want to be clear, we have to reach definite conclusions on definite subjects, but if we want to be true to the text, that can be hard to do. One last thing about dramatic context and self-examination that I need to get in for something I want to say later. Carving up the dialogues, relating dialogues to one another, respecting the provisionality of conclusions and contested terms. These are not just binds from which we cannot extricate ourselves, but I think, resources Plato gives us for interpreting the dialogues. Plato, as others have noted often, frequently, and well, does not speak in his own voice. Which means that we, in some sense, can't fail to have a hand in helping to determine what's at stake philosophically. And luckily for us, Plato puts characters in the dialogues who are making some of the same decisions that we have to make, and making some mistakes that, now that they've made them, we don't have to make them. So we can learn from what they do. I think the staging, the way Plato stages things, is a helpful resource for directing our reading. Dialogue form helps us not only understand what is being claimed in the arguments, so to speak, but helps us to see and appreciate what is being done with the arguments. And therefore, it helps us to see what we are doing with what we know. And this is a critical point that I want to make today. It's critical to what I'll go on to say. The philosophy is a matter of knowing, but also necessarily a matter of doing. And one of the key questions, it seems to me, that Plato is forcing us to consider is what we are doing with what we know. So let me now turn to the idea of metaphysical koinonia in the Parmenides and Sophist to try to, enact some of these principles that I've suggested here. Metaphysical koinonia, the way that I mean it, it can refer to, of course, the community between form and the participants, or something like that, form and the others, in such a way that heteron to something other, something else, comes to be present in the part whole, the complex whole of parts. That's true in the third hypothesis of the Parmenides, at least the way I read it. But today I'm focusing on metaphysical koinonia in a different sense, which is the participation of forms and other forms, or the combination of forms. A significant part of the work in the Parmenides is done to preserve the difference in kind between forms and participants, just to be able to open up that difference. The key is not only to determine how forms commune, or what that means for the forms, that they are participants in some sense, but to do so in a way that doesn't level the relationship between forms and participants. So I'm just going to call that the problem of leveling. That is the problem that the forms will be treated like things. Part of the puzzling aspect of the Parmenides is that Socrates there thinks of forms and participants in the beginning of the dialogue in terms that are so different that it turns out he's treating them in some important respect as essentially the same. And so when we learn to differentiate forms from participants, we do so by sorting out some of the same basic set of terms that apply to both, such as being, one, same, but sorting out the different senses in which these apply. And the two most important terms that need to be sorted out are being and one, the different senses that apply of being and of one to forms and participants. So at 129E2, just sort of getting into some details, Socrates mentions the synchronistai mixing of forms in a challenge to Zeno. Socrates says that he would be very astonished if forms could be subject to the puzzles that fill Zeno's book, the one that he brought to Athens. Forms, because they don't stand in a context of relationality like things do, would escape these refutations or these puzzles, so Socrates thinks. The ensuing conversation with Parmenides reveals a number of ways in which Socrates is at a more or less complete loss to distinguish forms from their participants, specifically with respect to the way each is one. This comes up because Parmenides treats forms as complex wholes of parts, sharing part by part or as a whole. And he treats them as one of many individuals, and Socrates just doesn't have any idea how to respond. The greatest difficulty argument, Megiston Aporia at 133a to 134e, particularly targets the problem of leveling that I was mentioning, that is, the problem of treating the difference in kind between forms and participants as a mere difference, which results in making the forms countable alongside participants as members of the same object field of which they, the forms, are the causes. This argument concludes with the reductio that the gods would know nothing of human matters, and human nature would be unable to know the forms. So it's interesting to me that this is posed as both an ontological problem of participation, and B, as a problem in the way we relate to the gods. It's a little silly, but I want to call this latter problem a piety problem. And I want to distinguish it from the ontological problem that I'm talking about here, in order to say that, erotic life is going to solve the piety problem and metaphysical analysis will solve the ontological problem. These are two separate modes of analysis, and we need both. Neither is reducible to the other. So in response to the ontological problem, Parmenides stops at 135b8 to c2 to establish what is ultimately at stake in the dialogue as a whole. And it's this: if we do not allow that there are forms of things and we won't demarcate a form for each thing, our dianoia, our thought, will have nothing toward which to turn, no single form that is always the same for each thing, and we will completely destroy the power of dialogistai, dialectic, dialogue, one of those, so somewhere in that range. Dialogistai, what is that power? In this context, I take it that it has to be the very possibility of inquiry oriented toward and capable of knowledge in the strongest sense. What has, I think, nicely been termed veridical predication, the type of articulation, discursive articulation of what the form is in definitional terms. Consider what Socrates in the Republic says about the damage done in the name of dialogistai. Here is a way of understanding. This will give us a way of understanding what happens if we lose veridical predication, because it might seem to you that nothing happens. It might seem like nothing happens, but apparently, in fact, we lose everything. Socrates tells a story comparing beliefs about the just and the beautiful to the parents of a young person. When those beliefs are questioned and refuted, the young person discovers that the beautiful is no more beautiful than it is ugly, and the authority of those parental figures is overthrown in favor of a life of flattery. Everyone's familiar with this. The disaster described here is blamed specifically on the youthfulness of the young person. Socrates says that an older person would refuse to take part in that madness, but would instead imitate someone employing dialectic in the search for truth. The conversation in the Parmenides is, I believe, just that search for truth that the older person would supposedly imitate. In order to preserve the power of dialogistai, then we need to be able to say how forms can be the sources of the being of things, specifically how they can be the structuring cause of things in space and time. This will allow us to know things in space and time, and how they can commune with one another to provide knowledge in the strong sense just mentioned, withstanding refutation like those in Zeno's book, or like those in the greatest aporia, which show each one to be no more itself than its opposite. So I've said two things. One is that the power of dialogosthai, were we to lose it, would result in some calamitous, maybe something calamitous like the present situation in which, the world is, people pursue a life of flattery and pleasure. And I've said also that dialogosthai, were it to be preserved, would preserve the possibility of inquiry into the being of things and inquiry that would result in knowledge. Okay, so Carolina, how many minutes have I been going?
You have 13 minutes for the 40 minutes. So if you want to leave 10 minutes for discussion, please finish in 3 or 4 minutes.
Oh, really? 3 or 4 minutes? That's wow.
Sorry, my mistake. 30 minutes to 13 minutes to 30 minutes.
Okay,
Sorry,
so 13 minutes. Okay. So the employing the interpretive strategy mentioned earlier, it seems as if looking at the hypotheses, one might want to consider what the meaning of preserving the power of dialogosthai, the dunamis of dialogosthai, would be, and I think that that is the right way to approach things. We have to nominate something that dialogosthai fundamentally does. And that would be allowing thought to turn towards something in the context of inquiry, not accidentally. I think that maps pretty nicely onto Parmenides, the historical Parmenides poem. In the text itself, we see Parmenides indicating that the subject of the hypotheses should be forms, and that he says we should observe Zenonian method with respect not to sensibles only, but with respect to those things that one might above all grasp by means of logos and think to be forms. So we have a pretty good indication that by looking at the ethical context, we can come up with a reasonable expectation for the subject of the hypotheses. Much more, that's very sketchy, much more work could be done, but that's basically how that approach would work. And then there is another ethical dimension, I think, that comes out, which is that the hypotheses are described as exercises. They demand that we examine all sides of an argument, and I think that that bears clearly on the way in which we can habituate ourselves, or we are called on to habituate ourselves away from the philonychia and philotimia that Socrates and Zeno have pretty well exhibited in the early part of the dialogue. So the theme of the youthful non-philosopher and the more mature philosopher, I think helps us to understand something about why the hypotheses are considered exercises. The sophist, I think, helps to continue that process of maturation by helping the budding dialectician confront the so-called enemy from within, the enemy from home, which is the philosopher who thinks that she knows what she means when she says being, but in fact has not yet fully worked that out. So that's the metaphysical koinonia. And so for the last 10 minutes, I'm just going to talk about what I refer to as the problem of piety and say why the sense in which eros is necessary for dialectical inquiry. I am claiming that erotic life can't be reduced to participatory structures and that that's important. There's an important sense in which there is a part of philosophy that is outside of participation. I think that's important to Plato. And my stronger claim is that philia and eros serve as a necessary complement to dialectical study, such that metaphysical inquiry in a Platonic context can't really succeed without this supplement. My basic claim is that dialectical study must be complemented by a dimension that determines or that is open to question of the question of what we are doing with our knowledge and what we are doing with the theoretical work that dialectic entails. One way of putting this that might be helpful, I'm actually not sure, is that theory requires a sense of moderation that does not grow out of theoretical understanding. And this is something that I think this moderation is something that I think Plato locates in interpersonal erotic life, specifically locates this at the level of perception and doxa, surprisingly, and even more specifically in the sight of the beauty of the beloved, in the sight of the beauty of the eyes and the opsis or look of the beloved in particular, to be most specific. So, and I'm drawing on the Phaedrus. So I'll start out with the Gorgias quickly, 507 D6 to E6. Socrates says to Callicles that if one wants to be happy, it's necessary to live looking toward the target of justice and moderation. He says these virtues constitute the basis of a life that is dear to gods and men, and which in turn makes possible Koinonia, which I take to be social relations, which in turn make possible Philia, which I take to be a step beyond social Koinonia. And that's my focus as I turn to the Phaedrus, 253 E5 to 255 A1, where Socrates describes something like a fork in the path of life, so to speak. One direction, we are initiated into moderation and justice, and in the other direction, we are initiated into what Socrates calls slavish economizing, which is actually just Stephen Scully's brilliant translation, which I love. Slavish economizing. This tracks the difference between Lysias's speech, that is the earthbound economizing, and Socrates' second speech, that is moderation that makes room for the divine. And that's basically my definition of divine moderation, moderation that makes room for the divine. Socrates, using the imprecise, explicitly non-dialectical account of an image of the soul as a chariot driven by two horses, describes the birth of divine moderation in the following way. The moment that the charioteer catches sight of the eyes of the beloved, the unruly horse is carried away by force, continually carried away, over and over again, wearing everyone else down by dint of repetition until everyone finally agrees to submit to his command to engage in explicitly sexual intimacy. However, once the soul draws near to the beloved and sees the beloved's face, opsis, flashing like a lightning bolt, the charioteer's memory is transported into the presence of the beautiful itself, and he sees Eden, beauty, standing with Sophrosune on a holy pedestal. This encounter initiates such a violent jerking back on the reins that both horses fall into disarray. The unruly horse, understandably, but still amazingly, proceeds to verbally abuse the others for being cowards and for failing to live up to their agreement, as if that's what the unruly horse is about. It's about contracts. The charioteer uses all means, again, repeatedly, polakis, lies, violence, whatever it takes, until eventually it comes to pass that when the unruly horse sees the beloved, it is devastated by fear. I wonder, fear of what? I guess like war, violence, and lies. I don't know, but devastated by fear. The result is that the whole soul follows the beloved with awe and a sense of shame. So the point is just that the face, the opsis, the eyes, the oma of the beloved, when present to our sight, again, opsis in some kind of a mirror relationship, cultivate a genuinely erotic moderation. Coupled with the theme of eros as a kind of divine madness, this is what I would take to be a kind of erotic piety, that is a a moderation that makes room for the divine. And that's what I think theoretical work needs and can't do without. How much time now? Sorry, I should use a clock.
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Yeah, so I think that the suggestion is at least there. I haven't been able to make an argument, but the suggestion is there. I want to just say that the theme of generosity is necessary, I think, to successfully understanding what being is, but it's not, that can't be understood theoretically, it can't be understood metaphysically. I think that generosity is a term that for Plato is only ever dealt with in the context of images. For instance, the image of the unbegrudging demiurge in the Timaeus, who provides a structured world. Or the image of Socrates in the Republic, who is there talking to everyone, inexplicably telling them that philosophers need to be forced to come and do the very thing that he's doing. Or the description that Diotima has in the so-called higher mysteries of the unbegrudging or unjealous appreciative work that's done in the presence, reproduction in the presence of the beautiful. I think that these are the only ways in which we can understand the good. That is through images, and the most striking, the most arresting, and the most and the initiating point in all of the images that I've found is in this description of the ousias of the beloved. That seems to me to be a trigger or an initiator that stands dramatically outside of participatory relations, can't be explained in those terms, and yet completes the metaphysical story that we are telling when we preserve the power of dialegasthai, thinking about the koinonia of forms in the Parmenides and sophist. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So we are open for questions. Please raise your hand some way I can see it. Yeah, Alan Pishnik. Sorry if
Close
I
enough.
mispronounced it.
Eric, that's a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the eyes of the beloved. Obviously, that's a pregnant passage, right? You've got the Alcibiades 1 moment, right? I really like the idea that it's not a participatory relation. I think when you described the talk in your abstract, you said it turns out truth isn't a possession. I know you didn't quite get to that in this, but I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how to describe that erotic relationship if it's not participatory. I mean, it's something else. What it reminds me of is our experience of wonder a little bit. And so I don't know. I really think this is very provocative. Could you just say a little bit more about what is going on if not participation?
Right. Yeah. So, well, thank you, Alan. That's a question that I find really tracks what I'm saying really well, and it's really tough to answer. Well, in my view, participation is always a matter of structure, and it's always a matter of primarily of determining and understanding norms. And I think that's why the Cora description in the Timaeus is riddled with all of these qualifications that Timaeus makes, that he's they're going to be talking about something extremely difficult and wonderful. That is, the Cora is making room. Fundamentally, I think that's what it does. And therefore, making room for structure, it's not something structured. That's repeated. So I think that there's something similar in erotic experience, that what's fundamentally happening is making room for structure, which means being able to be unstructured, or being able to be sort of outside of structure, which means that it is outside, I think, strictly speaking, has to be outside of participatory relations. So that's the one thought.
Yeah, that's good. That helps. There's something, so in a way, so the erotic then is I mean, it's, the tyrant ends up being really close to the philosopher, because in a sense, right, they're both lawless. Eros is properly, I mean, we could say structureless, but I guess I want to say lawless, right?
Yeah.
Is that fair? Yeah.
I think that's well. So I think it's completely fair, and I just haven't made up my mind entirely about what I want to say about Eros, and that because it might be the case that I'm trying to talk about the starting point of Eros, and so I'm also outside of talking about Eros, but that's too vague. The thing you said about the tyrant being lawless and unstructured, that's 100% got to be right, because the tyranny is not a regime, properly speaking. It doesn't have structure, properly speaking, and that's an interesting suggestion to put up here for consideration, because that's kind of structurelessness that doesn't make any room for, like, what I want to call Eros.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Another question? We still have some minutes. Eric, can I ask you, I'd love to hear you a little bit more about this passage on Republic 7 about dialectics that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And how, because in a way that I think it can be read, so I couldn't look it up right now, but in a way it can be read that, you have to be old to do dialectics about beauty and justice and important values, this kind of ethical koinonia that you're referring to. But it suggests that, when you have like mathematical notions, the one, for example, thinking about the Parmenides, that's not a problem. That, the problem is that you have to be old, because, so that's what a little bit of what I would like to understand, because you have to be old, because then if you're old, you won't agree so fast about things, like you think about the Euthydemus, then right, you want heuristics instead of dialectics. But if this is true, then it seems that dialectics, like this structural dialectic, can be is like not harmful, and another one would be harmful in youth. So how does this go in your general distinction? And just to hear more about that.
Right. So I I think you're suggesting that mathematical study and dialectical study are something that someone could pursue without needing to be mature in the sense that Socrates is saying in Book 7. That is something that a young person could pursue, as long as we're not talking about the beautiful, the just, and so on. Maturity doesn't factor in and is not a deciding issue. Is that right?
I think this is the way of reading this passage. I'd like to know if this is the way you're reading it.
Right. Well, just give me a sec to think about this. I think that it's exactly right in the context of the Republic to say that Glaucon and Adeimantus have a kind of life choice to make, whether they're going to live a life of philotimia or philonychia, or whether they're going to live a life of virtue. And my sense of the Republic is that, from Socrates' point of view, the conversation succeeds if these two can choose a life of virtue, and the rest of it is who knows who that's for. Maybe it's for the readers. It doesn't have to be for Glaucon and Adeimantus. So dialectic doesn't have to be for them. They don't have to study mathematics. At least it doesn't seem so to me. So I think that the reference to someone more mature is directed at Glaucon and Adeimantus. And I don't know exactly how to take that, how literally to take that. I mean, I think that Socrates in the Parmenides is like 19, 20 years old. He's not very old, but he's going to be able to engage in looking at both sides of the argument in a way that would presumably allow him to resist the temptation to beat people in heuristic, or to lose sight, to live a life of flattery. I mean, he seems like he's just on his way to living a life of philosophy. I think it's a harder question for me to answer whether the distinction between sort of value forms and the mathematical studies in that description in Book 7 suggests that maturity just doesn't matter when you're doing mathematics, and that you can therefore do metaphysics without this supplement that I've been claiming is necessary. I think that that's certainly true in the context of that Socrates is speaking of in Book 7, which is mathematical study. That's just preparatory to dialectic. What I have in mind is ultimately the sort of successful dialectician, what they're doing with dialectic, which presumably would be something that would only be relevant years later. So I think that passage that requires maturity really is referring to the necessity for sort of experience, or requires age, let's say, really should be referring to experience and maturity. And that's something that people can get by exercising in the way that Parmenides recommends.
Thank you. Colin Smith?
Yeah, thanks. I'm actually going to pass my question for now, because I see someone else has their hand up and I'm still trying to figure out how to formulate mine.
Okay, Michael Whittle?
Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to understand, I don't know if you quite got to this in full, but why these interpersonal erotic relationship or experience or whatever is necessary in order to engage in dialectic well, which is what I thought you're arguing. So I guess I'll just ask it, like, is it because in interpersonal erotic life one becomes, I don't know the right word, but like attuned or responsive to the manifestation of structure, and then that's also what one needs to do in dialectic? Like, is that, is that the sort of direction you're thinking, or is there another way that you're going with this?
I think, Michael, I think that's basically right. Like so I rather than being attuned to structure, I suppose what I'm focusing on is the idea of generosity, and so the idea of the good within structure. So I think that that's the idea of the good within structure isn't something that metaphysical analysis is going ever to provide. And that the particular way in which at least an embodied soul understands generosity is through erotic experience, because that's the place in which we make room for the divine, which we, as the diatima describes in the symposium, the daimon is the one who transmits what the gods say to the side of mortals in such a way that the whole tapan can relate itself to itself. In order to get to that situation, one has to be receptive, and it seems to me that in the diatima discussion speech in the symposium, and in the way that the Timaeus describes the likely story, we're getting in senses of in which images of our receptivity to the world, and I'm claiming that receptivity is most lives most of all in erotic life.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Calling the last question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so my question isn't very well formed. It's definitely similar to the others that have been posed. I'm still trying to understand what it means to be outside of participation, because it almost feels like an oxymoron, when I first hear that phrase. But I think that the way that you're talking through some of these issues is helping me to see what that means, something that's prior to structure that allows for the possibility of structure and its relationship to individuation. So I guess my question is what that leaves us with in your account insofar as we understand koinonia. I haven't fully tracked, I mean, I get the gist of the metaphysical ethical koinonia distinction that you're making, but it seems like, and I guess here's my question, is this right? It seems like your thesis then is that koinonia, like at least in the case of particulars and human individuals, koinonia is something that's somehow posterior, that has to kind of be prepared, the way has to kind of be prepared for it. So my question is that right? Is that where your account leaves us with respect to koinonia? And could you say a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I think so. So thanks, Colin. So the idea just is that what we are doing with metaphysical analysis is a question of the good, and the way in which metaphysical koinonia, or the forms participating in one another, exemplifies the generosity of the good is another issue of a matter of the good, and that metaphysical structure, the intelligible structure we see in the world, is not only an expression of the good through the koinonia forms, the participation of forms in one another, but it is one of our relationship to that intelligibility, whether we use it as a tool or as with respect, or however we relate to what we know and to the world. That's the primary opportunity or arena within which we are going to decide what it is that we should do in life. So from the side of the sources of structure all the way to the other side of what we're doing in our lives in relationship to what we know and so on. At those extremes, there is just an issue of the good, a question of what is the good. I don't think I would go as far to say that there can't be structure. Well, I don't know what I would say in relationship to what I thought you were saying about the very possibility of structure in the world. I think that if we study the Timaeus, we are committing ourselves to a certain understanding of the chora as making room and nous as structuring. But I'm not prepared to like line that up with what I've said today, which is so oriented toward ethical life.
Thank you, Eric. We don't have more time, so I think we're gonna finish here. We'll all meet here in Lima again tomorrow at 9 in the morning in Lima. I wish you could go have a pisco.
Yeah, we might have dinner tonight. Have a drink all together.
Okay, thank you all. It was a great session. We'll see you tomorrow.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Ciao Silvio.
Ciao Raul. Un grande piacere rivederti, purtroppo a distanza.
Grazie.
È un piacere grande di rivedere tutti. Ciao.
Ok, bye bye, ciao.